Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the newest album from Noname Sundial. You know what? Say this about Noname, she sure as hell does not make it easy. Now, that's been true since 2016's Telephone, where her bars will tumble and tangle over some pretty challenging production. But ever since her 2018 breakthrough with Room 25, you could tell that her attitude had started to change. Her songs were no less thorny, but they were now paired with jazz rap production that felt a bit more accessible. And while her wordplay was still dense as hell, you could tell that she was trying to be a little more challenging in what was being said beyond just how she said it, showcasing the sort of messy multitudes where she would deconstruct the systems in which she and the rest of us all live, as much as, she had to live and survive within them. But perhaps what was more important was the confrontational energy that Noname delivered all of this with. She's clearly intelligent and very well read, where the challenge only seemed to rise if you actually kept up with her. It was a sort of energy that seemed destined to provoke a lot of controversy and response, and what do you know, that was exactly what happened. It started off pretty early with a reflexive critique of the increasingly white audience for her sound, who weren't exactly going to go out and challenge the power structures that benefit them, which, for the record, that's more true than it's not, but that line of critique took her closer to black leftist and activist movements, and that drove her to start Noname's book club, working to elevate black-owned bookstores and actually send books to prisons. The sort of work that can very quickly become a full-time job, and where I honestly would not have been remotely surprised if Noname never put out another album. The work took precedence, and honestly, I respect her the hell for that. But her presence was still active, drew a lot of attention, especially from rappers. Probably the biggest embarrassment in J. Cole's career and his attempted response to her was Snow on the Bluff, which really only revealed his own ignorance and how so many were not prepared to deal with the wave of black leftism where Noname was finding herself, made all the more apparent in some of her veiled critiques of Beyonce's incorporation of Pan-African aesthetics in the service of US-based imperialist capitalism for the Black is King film. And unsurprisingly, it got her a lot of backlash from the Beehive. Now, on the one hand, is Noname always the most eloquent in addressing some of these issues, and that might provoke outrage if the work being done within the system will still be perceived by many as a net good? I'd say no. I'd say Noname would probably agree with that. We're all works in progress. But that does not make Noname wrong, though. Hell, I made a lot of the same damn critiques of Renaissance last year and its curation and appropriation of queer culture, and so implicitly did Special Interest on their phenomenal album Endure, and frankly, it's under a lot of the same roots as the increasingly strident black leftist critique of Beyonce and Jay-Z and the whole hegemony in entertainment that they've been constructing for a couple decades now. And if you can't tell by now, I'm kind of in treacherous waters, because even if I think I might have some valid points here, it looks the type of way when I'm the one who's wading this far into it, and while I like keeping the same energy and intensity that Noname brings to the table, it's one of the reasons that she's so compelling as an artist, given that it's been 5 years since Room 25, and her movements to a more complex leftist position already made that much more dicey given some of the guest verses reportedly on this album. I should not be the one controlling or dictating any conversation. It's a bad look. And you know what? As soon as this album winds up among Cornbread Tube and a lot of black leftist critics, it'll probably spark a more lively, lived-in conversation than what I can probably bring. But I'm also a music critic, and this is one of my most anticipated rap albums of 2023, alongside Dessa coming later this year. And I've never been one to shy away from the complicated conversation. So what did we get with Sundial? Oh boy. So albums like this are really frustrating to discuss. Not because they are bad, the hell that would make this easier, but that this album is great, but also flawed in exasperating ways that are dominating the conversation. And that's gotta suck for Noname. This is her first album, and in 5 years, it's got a lot of critical hype behind it. It shows a thematically layered and dense expansion of the themes from Room 25, but also with a more thoughtful, relevant, activist edge. But it's also a confrontational project that occasionally leans into its worst elements. It's daring the audience to call it out so the finger-pointing and liberal arguments of hypocrisy can erupt. And those arguments are just not productive. And I think Noname knows that. And I think there's also a part of her that hopes this will demystify her platform enough that the whole impossible standards go out the window. And yet the more listens I gave this and the more convinced I was of this album's quality, the more it feels like Sundial just can't get out of its own damn way. This album has the feel of arguing online with leftists who are very doomer-pilled, and while you know deep down you share far more in common than you don't, it's the smallest and most emotionally charged differences that feel the most bitter and insurmountable. And you know in your gut, it's not really that much about ideology anymore. Ironically, even with all of Noname's subs towards him on this album, this feels very much like the sister release to Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers by Kendrick Lamar. Not just sonically in the more organic roots and jazz and R&B and soul, but also in its messy, very human contradictions, where you get the point of its deconstruction of platforms, but you find yourself frustrated in the methods of execution, where I'd say the political insight is better here, and on a structural and production level, I actually do think this album is better, but it also can feel like a much harder listen, with more bitterness than enlightenment. That also means this review is going to be going way longer than it probably should be, but I had a lot to say, so strap in. And you know, right from the start, you know what makes this such an emotionally exhausting experience? It's the reality that on the sound, the production alone, I'd argue this project's fucking amazing. Whereas Room 25 could still feel a little listless or still coiling in around itself, this project runs on phenomenal bass lines and gentle percussion and those warm, supple melodic foundations. It's a more strident project with a lot of momentum that runs just over 30 minutes, and it honestly feels shorter than that. And it's also contributed to improvements with Noname as a rapper and performer. This album does not play as coy as she occasionally would on Room 25. Trading in a lot of the winking and deflection for something that's more energetic and forceful off some of the sharper drums and minor key pianos on Balloons and Toxic, or having the synths ebb off that upright bass and the bouncier percussion on Namesake, but still with plenty of that low-key charm, like on the muffled drums and the warping synths behind Afro futurism. There are more body blows being delivered here, and they hit a lot harder. And you know what? I'd say the hooks here are better too. Getting Ayoni's more charged, gospel-inspired vocal runs, that was a really good step for Boom Boom with the fun, splashy horns, and Oblivion with its loose, watery funk vibes, and with all the instrumentation feeling more prominent and less tangled in itself by leaning more on lush, soulful backing vocals like on Hold Me Down. I mean, I wouldn't really call this anthemic, but the charisma really does manifest. Now, there are a couple moments that didn't quite click on a production level. Beauty Supply felt a little flat for me with a very restrained backing vocals and the horns meandering around the back, but for a project that flows so goddamn well, it's honestly kind of hard for me to find instrumental choices that feel out of place, even if the considerably more minimalist production ensures you're going to hear every word from everyone, for better and yeah, for worse. Because when we get to the guest rappers, yeah, you know what? Common's verse is not as good as it should be. It kind of reminded me of when Janae Aiko let him end things on Sold Out. I get that Common's an authoritative presence to wind it all up and a pretty good rapper when he wants to be, but I think Noname probably should have had the final word. But I gotta say, Billy Woods and Silk Money, they really showed up on gospel. One of the biggest highlights on the record, and on production that I honestly don't know how well either of them could have utilized it, but they sounded great. We'll get into the content from them later on, but man, they really made that song work. But, of course, that is not the guest verse that everyone is talking about. And we should really bring it up sooner rather than later because, believe it or not, it actually encapsulates a lot of the thematic complexities and messiness that needs to be discussed with Sundial and its content. And that's the verse on Balloons from Jay Electronica. Let's clear the obvious out of the way quickly. Yes, Jay Electronica spouts a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory nonsense and shouts out the leader of the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, directly. But on top of that, it's not really that clever of a verse or cohesive with the song and the themes that Noname's trying to explore, and that continues to prove my running theory that Jay Elec is probably one of the most wildly overrated rappers, especially by other rappers, in the game right now, with precious little to really show for it in terms of his own projects. I mean, he can be focused effectively, that's why I didn't bring his shit up when reviewing Rory's album this year, especially as you didn't do all of this in that verse. But I also talked about Jay Electronica spewing this sort of thing back in 2020 when Jay-Z platformed and co-signed a lot more of his junk on a written testimony. And quite frankly, I don't remember that many people bringing nearly the same energy for Jay-Z or as they have for Noname. Hell, I'm not sure they brought a lot of this energy for Jay Electronica himself, or any number of rappers who have co-signed this sort of thing for decades now, often way more explicitly. Now, as to why this is on the album, because unless everyone in Noname's circle are as dumb as rocks, they had to know this backlash is coming, well, the conversation does get a lot thornier. I'm inclined to believe that Noname does not buy into any of this. Even if she did, well, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. Even Karl Marx was not immune. It would be disappointing, but not surprising, and Lord knows Noname does not give a shit about her audience's disappointment and her not living up to moral standards. But you know what? I'm also inclined to go with Occam's razor here. Jay Electronica is Noname's favorite rapper. She was not gonna turn down a verse, and demanding an artist of considerably more wealth, clout, and status, who also happens to be a vocal member of the Nation of Islam, especially given their militant presence in Chicago. I mean, demand he change his verse to suit her indie left-leaning politics that really don't align with his black capitalist arc? I don't see that conversation happening. Or going well, even if it had, because especially in a certain thematic context of this album, the verse actually makes a lot of sense to be here. I mean, from the album cover to every barbed critique that she throws at black celebrity capitalism and herself for playing along within that system, this is an album that wants to actively blow up the pedestal that she's been getting placed on, a thumb in the eye at anyone who wanted her to be more respectable, or highlighted just how much potential that she had, which she literally references on the very cutting, potentially the interlude, and it sets up the expectations for which she didn't ask for. And you know what? It's not surprising to me at all. I mean, it was a running theme on Room 25. Were you paying attention? Where the messy wholeness of her experience, but just enough coy deflection, got so much praise for those who are now turning on where there's a lot more very human ugliness to be revealed. And she's actually going to go further from there. In the first two verses on Balloons, they're some of the sharpest from her on the album because they highlight the sick reality of the performance of trauma in art under capitalism. Not just the expectation of the hustle to make it work amidst a systemic reality that many in her white audience will not understand, but also then to be consumed by a predominantly white audience that will just treat it as entertainment, or worse still, think that their consumption actually counts as activism and doing something. I mean, the metaphor of the black balloon is kind of identical to when Denzel Curry used it, but for him, it was a buoyant moment for his downward spiral on Taboo. For Noname on Sundial, she knows it's what's keeping her head above water. Maybe it'll hopefully pay the rent. I mean, you feel all the more complicit in the system, especially when you find success in that system, as she highlights on Namesake, preaching against it to an audience that will love to give lip service, but isn't actually gonna do shit, or it becomes this reflexive black-pilled envy on the left that advances nothing. And while Noname is more outspoken than most in pointing that finger, I mean, one, it's not like she doesn't have valid points or emotions here, and two, she's received considerably more backlash than the majority of her peers on both the left or otherwise who advance similar arcs. I mean, be they leftists, activists, or artists reflexively examining and deconstructing their own celebrity. And especially given that Noname is still unsigned, she has no label apparatus to defend her from this backlash or coach her on it. You can tell the album in which Sundial's most in conversation is Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. And the thematic parallels are fascinating. Jay Electronica's verse is Kodak Black's presence for Kendrick, a reminder of very flawed humanity that might reflect your own darker impulses, or just some of that slight dark thrill of transgression, owning your own hypocrisy, daring the audience to question it, face their own. It's the Blacker the Berry all over again. The biggest hypocrite of 2023. But the parallel kind of breaks down from there because material conditions, gender, and one's relationship to America at large are points where it seems like Noname diverges significantly. She might never have felt the weight of biblical responsibility for respectability that Kendrick absolutely has, look back at Damn, and his own discomfort at wielding that power well, look at To Pimp a Butterfly. You'd think she would revel more in her own freedom, except I'm not sure she's as happy as she wants to be, or feels as centered as Kendrick ultimately felt by the end of Mr. Morale. And that makes sense. She's aware that this journey goes way beyond just her. She has some pretty harsh words for what is being framed as black liberation by a lot of liberals, especially on a global stage as she highlights the human cost of black capitalism, especially in Africa and Hold Me Down and Namesake, coming from the same military-industrial complex glamorized with guns. Little ironic given what Silk Money put in his verse, but hey, I won't begrudge him the sentiment. The acknowledgement of all those messy contradictions, it's all over this album. But then you get songs like Beauty Supply, which are exploring the contradictions of what presenting self-love looks like alongside a lot of tangled black beauty standards only reinforced by capitalism. And then you got Toxic, which is a messy song post-breakup touching on male ego and colorism and what she was actually drawn to in a bad relationship. And it reminded me a lot of what Kendrick Lamar interrogated in his own sexual desires and bad relationships on Worldwide Steppers and We Cry Together. Hell, then there's Afrofuturism, which is clearly drawn from a lot of her activist work and some of her communications with black men in prison, and that highlights trying to help those locked up under a lot of bullshit systems, especially the war on drugs. But then we got Black Mirror as the opener, spitting against a lot of toxic positivity, but near the end of her first verse, she highlights that even if she's a socialism sister, is it making her feel better? Is it paying her rent? Now, the second verse, and indeed a lot of the sexually charged boom boom, they felt more joyous and aspirational in the naked sexuality, especially interwoven with a lot of leftist themes. But this album is definitely trending towards darker framing and content, and while it can feel thematically poignant, it's not seeming to satisfy, be it the audience or even her. I mean, the easiest example of this is the closer Oblivion, where a charitable reading of the nihilistic understanding of one's power in the face of it all going away, and hell, there's merit in that. Malcolm X pulled from Nietzsche in crafting narratives of revolutionary black power and breaking down that system. But go to Billy Woods' verse on Gospel, it might be more revealing, speaking on the Zimbabwe War of Independence in the late 70s, and that heady euphoria of that moment with Robert Mugabe as an African nationalist and socialist fighting against British colonialism, but with the lingering bleak reality that what came after the Rhodesian Bush Wars for decades in Zimbabwe, especially leading into the 90s and 2000s. Now, Billy Woods has critiqued a lot of the idealistic, predominantly white and online socialist movements of not really grasping the harsh reality that comes with revolution. I mean, it was all over Ethiops just last year, and it seems in line with Noname highlighting the lip service that many of us on the left have to actually putting in the fucking work. But his framing is both more outside and academic. The moral complexities, they're definitely there, but it's more of a brutal fact of a hard life. That's texture in his sound. For Noname, all of it's at the forefront, where the provocation can often feel like its own reward, especially given the larger white audience that she has absolutely no problem disappointing. And you know what? Fair enough. There's a lot of folks who could afford to have their idealism confront some reality, but it also feels a bit self-defeating, where she could have made the thematic point that Jay Electronica's presence represents without him being on the record, but this album has a weird relationship with the hierarchies under capitalism anyway. Cut into them and yourself with critique, revel in all the disappointment, but even beyond the material conditions, still clinging to some of them emotionally, because you're ending the album by still playing rap's competitive game. And that leaves me wondering if there are deeper roots to what can feel like self-sabotage in the face of systems in which we do live our lives. Hell, in many places across both Room 25 and Sundial, you can tell that there is this underlying plea for grace from the audience or for herself, but also the sad reality that due to conditions under late capitalism and misogynoir, she knows she's probably not going to get it. And the backlash proves y'all don't have the smoke for so many who say worse or co-sign far worse, and I know that because I get the backlash when I call it out, so why not present all the ugliness? Thematically and emotionally, if not sonically, it's probably closer to another Chicago rapper who felt pushed closer to that brink, But from the opposite side of the political spectrum, Kanye West, Yeezus. And all of it's made so much more complicated by the fact that I still think this album is great. I mean, it's tight, it's insightful, it's well produced. It's challenging in ways that are uncomfortable and smarter than I think they're getting given credit. And I can also say that the Jay Electronica verse is bad, and it casts a pall on an album that we've been waiting for 5 years that also feels embittered, depressed, self-critical to the point of distraction, perhaps missing a better forest for the trees. And that can feel very discordant with the production and delivery that, while still feeling a little more forceful, is so warm and inviting and pleasant. It's an album that feels both more and less difficult than it can or maybe should be. And I get why a lot of folks are frustrated given that, again, first Noname album we've gotten in 5 years, and she's extraordinarily talented. And with that context, it's hard to look at Sundial and not acknowledge that it's really doing exactly what it's designed to do. And at the same time, I can also look at the output of Billy Woods, or JPEG Mafia, or Gaius Guevara, or Soul Glow, especially Algiers' album Shook from this year, which can be just as difficult, even more confrontational, but in the last case puts forward a vision of what revolutionary change can be when you actually get to the other side. Might not always be realistic, but it's aspirational, which I think Noname can struggle to see sometimes, and I don't even blame her for it. I should stress I don't have the final word on this. I get the feeling this album's going to fluctuate a lot throughout the rest of how I experienced 2023. And there's a lot of black voices on the left that I want to hear discuss this album, because there's layers to this, and I think I want to hear the stuff that I've inevitably missed get discussed. I don't think it's better than Room 25, but I think it's worth hearing. It's a hard as fuck conversation that's worth having. And hey, given that I've also had a run of disappointing people for over a decade now on that level of raw catharsis and being able to just let go, I certainly get it. Take that as you will. Just saying. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. I understand this got dense and political and philosophical, as I am wont to do on sort of reviews like that. Hell, go check my review of Kendrick Lamar's Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. There will be a link to it. But yeah, sometimes you need to get there. Sometimes an album is worth talking about, and it's, in my opinion, an album that I do legitimately think is great, is worth highlighting those flaws that are more tangled and complicated than I think they're getting credited beyond just a sheer cancellation. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get albums on my schedule, or just support me on Patreon, or hell, just get into my Discord and yell at me about this, I understand why. Link to that Patreon is right over there. Please don't feel obligated. Tough times, I understand. I'll be alright. But hey, if you want to, options available. Till then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse. I'll see you next time.